something unusual in the policy world that I inhabit and I'm so interested in, which is to say an unequivocal success story for the UK, a success story in the world of scientific research, achievement and exploration, but also a success story that branches into economic achievement, economic development. And one of the things I'm really interested in exploring today is the way that those two objectives, those two successes marry up, and the way that policy can help to create the conditions for further success in the UK space sector. We're sitting here now, we're actually in the 7th decade of the human space era. And you know it looking at the way that the UK space sector is growing. It's growing at something like 3 times the pace of the rest of our economy by some estimates. It's worth billions of pounds, it's employing tens of thousands of people, and the ambition of the people involved in the space sector, both on the government and state side and in the universities and private sectors, means that there's every chance that it can continue to grow in future as well. So the UK punches above its weight. In terms of scientific achievement, we're the home to pioneering achievements in low Earth orbit science, in the development of new kinds of satellites, innovations in telescopy, both radio telescopy and light telescopy, very low Earth orbit thinking, and one of the key questions I suppose today is to think about the extent to which we are supplying and helping to inspire the skills among young people and adults that will be required for a growing space industry as well. Because even if we look at the economic and scientific achievements so far, a growing part of our economy is something that needs to be fostered directly and made to flourish as well. So how can we do that? How can we attach the, if you forgive me, the boosters that are required to keep this rocket in high orbit? Well, that's what I'm hoping our panel here today will be able to help us to answer. I think we've assembled the perfect group of people to start to think about and address these kinds of questions. So starting to my immediate left, we are of course joined by George Freeman, Minister of State in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, but you often describe yourself as the Minister for Space, don't you, George?
I do.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that tells us a little something about the way you think about this part of your brief as well. To George's left, we have, of course, the Right Honourable Lord Willetts, who, apart from having a storied cabinet and shadow cabinet career, is also the chair of the UK Space Agency and has been since 2022. Professor Suzie Imber is perhaps one of the most well-known faces for UK space and space science, having won the 2017 BBC Two series Astronauts Do You Have What It Takes? Spoiler warning, she did have what it takes, and it will be I think an aspiring or potential astronaut candidate.
Who knows?
No, so when I say that, we don't want to do it, but of course she's also a professor of space physics at the University of Leicester. Also joining us from Leicester, we have Professor Richard Ambrosi, who is the Executive Director of Space Park Leicester, and I should add that all of this has been made possible thanks to our partnership with our fantastic sponsors today, the University of Leicester, so massive thanks to them as well. So I'm going to start proceedings very simply by asking to run down the table from my immediate left, starting with you, if that's all right, George, to give us a brief overview of your take on that set of questions about the future of space policy. What explains our success? How can we ensure it even more in the future? George.
Thank you. I just worked out with David yesterday that this is my 31st party conference. I first came in 1990, I think that's pretty good. His first conference was 76. We've got some incredible talent on this panel, so I'm going to stick to one bit of this agenda, which is really the economic bit. How do we, rather than the science bit, you might be surprised to hear, but how do we really attract the billions that we need into the UK space economy to make it a globally impactful sector? And I just start by saying how wonderful it is to start a party conference event on space, the Conservative Party conference on space, with a packed room. And I think in no small part that's due to David. Actually, when I was working with David at Bayes and he set out the 8 great technologies, subsequent governments have tried 7, have tried 5, have tried 3. I think the 8 great nailed it. You put space in there, and I think did as much as anyone to get people to understand it. And I've put it right at the heart of my portfolio. Before I get my 3 points out, just so you're aware, we've created a new department for science, innovation and technology. We've taken all of the science portfolio that David and I had at Bayes. It was 3/5 of the whole of the Bayes budget. but a sidebar in terms of ministerial. It was a net zero department. And we put it together with all the digital bits of DCMS. DCMS Academy used to say, we're the digital department, is what the D stands for. And Boris said, you have all like things for the department. So you can tell the whole thing needed a bit of tidying up. So we created a department for science, innovation and technology, and I'm the Minister for all of the research budgets, UKRI, the research councils, all the public sector research establishments, Innovate UK and the innovation piece. And my mission has been to try and take that science research agenda from the sort of dusty byways of academia in Whitehall and put it right in the mainstream of UK economic thinking, so that we get out of the boom and bust cycle of boom and bust economics, which I would suggest drives boom and bust politics, and build a really sustainable long-term future. I happen to think we're on the cusp, if we get this right, of a new Victorian golden age of investment pouring into Britain. We, as the new Victorians, designing the agri-tech, clean tech, that the world needs, some massive global challenges. And there is no greater laboratory in the world than the UK. And we're not just a lab, we're an innovation economy, an enterprise economy. And if we get the city financing it, and our regulators leaning in and creating the regulatory lit runways, we could, I think, genuinely be on the cusp of an extraordinary period where our grandchildren will say, tell us how you got out of a decade of boom and bust and turbulent chaos and unlocked a new era of prosperity. It's there waiting for us, and that's what drives me on every day. And I think there is no sector of which that's more true than space. So let me just frame what I learned. I didn't know the sector when I started. There's obviously, we're moving from an era of sort of Cold War, Russia, I think you can move on from now, China and America, big vertical sovereign, quasi and military commercial sovereignty, big programs to dominate this new frontier. And a global economy that needs to use space, particularly the low Earth orbits, for SATCOMs and communications and 101 really exciting applications. So it's in that context that I suggest our future isn't to be a military superpower in space, it's to be the people who create the regulatory and multilateral, global commercial ecosystem in which companies can access space safely, easily, and use and harness the extraordinary capability of the space sector to drive economic activity on Earth. And I think that's our challenge. If we do nothing, then I think China and America will dominate the whole thing, and they're very good at dominating all the supply chains. When NASA outsources everything to SpaceX, a great company, but we're going to be spectators on the space economy if we don't actually move and decide how Britain can operate. And I think this goes to the heart of our post-Brexit challenge. I think there is an opportunity for us to be one foot in Europe, not in the political and monetary union, but in the cluster of European nations, allies, partners. I'm delighted we're back in Horizon, including Copernicus. But one foot internationally. There are, if you look at the league table of other space nations, I asked my officials, well, who's in the second division then? Are we top of the second division? I asked. No, Minister, it's Japan, Canada, Switzerland, France, Italy. I said, well, where are we? Well, we're sort of out on our own. We're sort of a deep space science nation, highly respected. And we have incredible sort of downstream, so I've described us as a Formula One pit lane for the space economy. We've got incredible expertise and some pretty chunky companies. Surrey Satellites, CubeSat, Reaction Engines, Astro and Stevenage, now part of Airbus. So we may not have the AstraZeneca and the GSK, the big primes, but we've got an incredible ecosystem downstream. So I think the challenge for me is how do we really get the capital and get that sector plugged in globally so that we may not have a car, but there are a lot of Formula One engines and cars out there. They'll all need servicing by the UK sector. So that's how I'm thinking of it. So my 3 points are, firstly, if ever there was a sector that needs an industrial strategy, this is it. And David and I were card-carrying advocates back in 2010 for the Conservative Party to embrace industrial strategy for the 21st century. We don't mean beer and sandwiches and trade unions parked in number 10 doing deals on propping up failing companies. We mean the active state working with the private sector in partnership to create the infrastructure, the framework. We've done it in life sciences, and we could do it in a number of other sectors, and that's what I'm doing in DSIT. And I just make that point because I think this party's been a bit shy of those words. It sort of has echoes of failed corporatism, and I beg to differ. I think the Americans, the French, the Germans, the Italians, have all been doing this for years, and I think sometimes laughing at how the Brits do all the science, we back all the amazing technology, we do all the research, and then we give it all away. And I don't think there's anything wrong with this party saying, well, we're patriotic, economically ambitious globalists who want this economy to really be impactful. So that's my first point. The second is, if you look at the space economy in the UK, we proudly trumpet it's worth 17 odd billion. We should remember half of that is Sky TV subscriptions. Now, I don't say that to belittle it, but we need to be aware that that is the use of space at the moment for satellite SATCOMs. The other half is the R&D, the manufacturing, the supply chains. And if any of you haven't been to Glasgow, please do. I worked there 25 years ago in economic development. A city transformed largely by the space industry. Satellite city, incredible investment in photonics and quantum. And when the Labour leader of Glasgow City Council says to me, Minister, the transformation in this city in the last 8 years, words not mine, is something to behold. That tells you something about the power of this space sector in Glasgow, in Cornwall, in the Guildford M3 corridor down to the south coast, in Leicester, all around the country. It's a distributed network with a huge opportunity to drive that regional levelling up that we really need. And there are some big primes looking at the UK saying you've got brilliant R&D, brilliant universities, a brilliant tradition of space science. Are you really serious about growing a supply chain? And I think that question hangs over me every day, and the answer is yes. So let me come to my third point, which is what are the levers that we can pull? And there are three I want to particularly highlight. One is procurement. So on my whiteboard, Innovation Nation, there are two pieces going across from the catapults, deployment of funds, skills, key people, and then we pick up procurement and regulation, whether you voted for them or didn't. I didn't, but we've got them. These are new powers. We're not bound by state aid, and we're not bound by slow-moving European regulation. I think we should use them. And here's an opportunity. So across government, we've just asked every department, how much space data do you use? And the first thing is they don't really know. That's fine, they're all finding out. And the second thing is they'll be surprised by how much it is. And I'm looking at whether we couldn't create a procurement framework where every department, and DEFRA particularly, if we're going to modernise the way we do compliance at agri-environment, have got a big demand for this, and Richard Benyon totally gets it. Couldn't we create a framework where departments subscribe to the purchase of space data? Couldn't we go one further and create an SPRI and say, by the way, we want lots of little companies to support this, and we'll, if you're compliant, if the space agency think you're good enough, we'll give you a validation kind mark, part of the UK space data procurement programme. For lots of little companies, that would be a huge validation internationally. So there's a procurement bit. I'd go further. I mean, in life sciences, we've just placed 6 billion of procurement on novel vaccines in return for multi-billion R&D. This is the new game, and we're doing it. We haven't done anything like that in space. When you look at what the MOD, the ambitions the MOD has in space, now their procurement is very much the MOD's procurement, but I think there's a huge opportunity for us to lean in with them. Some of it will be secret squirrel stuff, by the way, some interesting quantum encryption and other bits. But there's quite a lot in there that we could do a proper UK, as we do with BAE, submarines, shipbuilding, with space, and without compromising our defence, we could just look a bit more strategically at how we might procure. Second is regulation. This is the one I'm really focused on. I can see a huge opportunity in the space sustainability agenda. 8,000 satellites up there, 3,000 redundant, 95% uninsured. Imagine for a minute a motorway system that you're invited to drive on, in which every third vehicle, particularly the big ones, are parked across the lanes. In fact, they're driving around. 95% of vehicles are uninsured. There's no regulatory compliance on manufacturing standards. Is that a motorway you'd like to drive on? I would suggest not. So what I'm working on is, couldn't we create a very basic space sustainability standard? If you are compliant, if your satellite doesn't just contribute to junk, can be retrieved, can be in-flight serviced by brilliant companies like Astroscale, if it's got basic compliance, we'll give you more competitive insurance, quicker licensing, and cheaper finance in the City of London. And I think we could make the City of London then, without having a prime based here, that would be lovely, but in the interim we could make it the headquarters of global sustainable space financing. Don't take it from me, because when I went to the City Convening Roundtable with Lloyds and Seraphim and everyone and asked them, they said, hallelujah, yes Minister, this is exactly right, They've put together the kite park, and we're going to be unveiling it in a couple of months. Their one challenge to me was, and here's my third point, Minister, don't do it unilaterally. Can you make sure some other countries are with us? So I went straight off to Japan, to Canada, to Switzerland, and said, look, rather than starting Beijing and Washington, why don't we, the smaller, responsible, sovereign space nations, create a kite park that everyone could come with us on? If we took a lead, did the heavy lifting, would you join us? The answer was yes. And I'm delighted to say that the Canadian Minister, Champagne, magnificent name, is coming over in the autumn to sign and support that kite park. And I think the Swiss may well come along as well. I don't want to bounce them into it, but now when the Swiss flag, the Union Jack and the Canadian flag, three flags that stand for international standards, start to support a kite park, I think we'll start to see people say, hooray, and London will become, by the way, Lloyd's insured the first ever satellites, and they're the biggest insurance market in the UK. So I want to suggest that a big part of my job is using those levers to make sure that we don't just have a brilliant science community, but we create a big economy. Skills is key, and we've got some brilliant people on my left who will talk about how we grow that ecosystem.
Wonderful, fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, and George, that was fantastic, and it's great to have you as a minister. And I have to say, when George convenes the meetings and brings together me and Paul Baker and the Space Agency and your officials, we always have really good discussions. And as you can see, George is committed and enthusiastic and expert. And in some of the stuff I was going to say, George has already covered, absolutely making it clear that space is useful and promoting its usefulness across Whitehall. There's definitely a government priority around sustainability, a very exciting and interesting agenda. And I should add that for me personally, having been for 5 happy years the Chancellor of the University of Leicester, it's great to see the role that University of Leicester particularly plays in all this. So I would just supplement George's remarks with a few quick other observations. First of all, there is a race on for who gets launch in Northern Europe as we shift from equatorial, well, there'll still be large-scale equatorial launch, but as you start looking for launching of smaller satellites into polar orbit, there is a race on, and of course New Zealand has got the Antarctic option, and for us in the Northern Hemisphere there's the north of Scotland, there's Sweden, there's Norway, and it's a close race. I think Norway are now moving quite fast. We have one advantage which George has always advocated, which is we've got a legal and regulatory regime in early. The fact that we've got legislation around space launch going back to 2017 is a great advantage for us and puts us a bit ahead of Norway and Sweden. And of course, we had in Newquay the first test of that regulatory regime. And if that regulatory regime can work for horizontal launch in crowded airspace, in an airport also used for civil purposes, then you can be pretty confident it can work in almost any environment. And I think what's happening up in Saxford and also Northern Scotland mainland, and companies like Skyrora and Orbex, and of course the developers of Saxford is incredibly exciting. So we've got a real opportunity there. I would secondly add to George's list the lunar economy. After 50 years when it's been quite sort of special, unusual lunar exploration, the next 10 years we're going to see more missions and activity in the moon than we've had in the previous 50. There's going to be a lot happening. And one of the things which George strategically led for us at the last ESA Ministerial was the UK getting a role, in partnership with Italy actually, in lunar comms. There is a service delivery opportunity of the people who provide the comms satellites around the moon so that every mission doesn't have to take up its own comms, and that is now something, Lunar Pathfinder, in which the UK has a significant opportunity. So having basically not been involved in any lunar activity for 50 years, we're now becoming a serious player. That's another opportunity for us. And I would put thirdly on my list the Leo constellation issue. George and I were both advocates of the government taking a strategic stake in OneWeb. The fact is that Leo constellations are crucial strategic assets. And we're very fortunate to have one of the world's LEO constellations operated out of Shepherd's Bush in West London. And obviously the new transaction, the merger with Eutelsat is a big change, but we still hope and believe that the UK can take this provides a big opportunity for the UK, and especially for a supply chain as we look to Gen 2 OneWeb satellites. So I'd add those 3 items to the list, and perhaps just to comment on a couple of other points. So, speaking as chair of the Space Agency, our Space Agency doesn't operate on the same scale as the French or German or even Italian Space Agency. But paradoxically, in some ways, it is an advantage. It means that we don't try to do large amounts of detailed technological design work in-house. It means we're much more open to working with the private sector. And our North Star metric, our priority at the Space Agency is to promote private sector space activity. And we try to use our modest budget, we try to use our budget most effectively to promote private activity. And it's interesting still when people come from ESA and compare what we do with other space agencies, they see that that is a very good way of seeing your role. And it is an unusual perception of role. It's not how many other of the national space agencies see their role. And I think that's a great contribution we can make. And then my final observation, thinking of the interventions we're about to have from Leicester, is I never forget a very wise observation that Jean-Jacques Dordain made, the former Director General of ESA. Because I was turning up and making the point that British ministers and representatives always make. We've got to focus on getting a business return and promoting business opportunities. And he said, yeah, he understood all that. And the Brits always came along and said that. But he did at the end point out, but by the way, when I am summoned by a head of government, a very senior minister across Europe from an ESA member state, who want me to come and see them and brief them, it is almost always about something we've done in science. It is almost always about a scientific mission that we've sent to a distant planet or to an asteroid. And so he reminded me that even on his evidence of what actually got national political interest, we shouldn't forget the importance of just doing space-based science, which I thought was a way to hand
that
over.
Was very kind.
I hand over to the professor from Leicester.
Thank you. So I'm a space scientist and I work on missions. I'm working on a mission right now for Bepi Colombo on its way to Mercury. It'll get there in 2025. And researchers in my field use all sorts of equipment from the James Webb Space Telescope. We think about space weather, we do all sorts of different things. And I think one thing that makes us a little bit different perhaps is that the timescales on which we work are really long. So this mission I'm working on now, they started thinking about it in the year 2000, gets to Mercury in 2025, it will be there for a year, maybe 2 years we hope, we'll see. And that's most of someone's career. So when we're thinking about employment and skills, we have to be thinking really long term. We need people who have the expertise to design and build instruments on these missions. And then we need to keep them for an extended period while the mission is in development and launches and when it gets there. And then on to the next mission so we can use their skills. So our time frames are really, really long. And I started thinking about kind of skills in the workforce a few years ago. Like I accidentally ended up being on a reality television series about astronaut selection, which I look back and think, how did that happen? And it got me really interested in thinking about, okay, I've got all these videos of me floating around on a microgravity plane or squashed in a centrifuge or all these things. How can I use that to try to encourage more people to get into STEM? Because we all know we have a problem here. I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody that we need to get more young people into STEM. And think about things like A-levels. If we have less than 5% of students taking physics A-level, for example, we need to increase that number. It's been really stubborn for a really long time, and of that, about 23% are female. We see big socioeconomic bias, big ethnicity bias as well, and we have a mountain to climb, and we've been trying hard over the years, and we don't seem to have shifted the balance. And so I began to wonder, whether we could start to think about that, and whether I could play a role with my silly videos floating around. The answer is yes, actually, in lots of ways. So I'll talk a bit about what we're doing, but this is not a Leicester-specific programme. There are universities across the country that are working really hard on this. And I think we can get a bit stuck in thinking that our job is to educate people aged 18 and above, but we need to work more on the pipeline of getting people to that stage. And you might think that a professor doesn't necessarily belong in a primary school, but actually I think we do, because actually we're the people that can say, well, I have a great career in space, this is what I do, this is why I love it, this is what you could do. And there's lots of evidence that by the time someone gets to secondary school, they've already decided if they want to do science or not. So just working with A-level students isn't enough. We've got to go back earlier and not just reach the student, but maybe reach the teachers, maybe the local community. You know, we know that people's parents, families and community influence their decision making in life. So that's quite a big task, isn't it? I've set myself a challenge there. But there's lots of ways that we can do that. So whether that's sending our undergraduates, our PhD students, our staff into schools, primary schools, secondary schools, showing them some cool equipment that we have access to that maybe they don't. We just started a residential program working with young people from widening participation backgrounds, bringing them onto campus for weekends. We live in halls of residence. I live in hall of residence with them for the weekend, which is it's been a long time since I stayed in the hall of residence. You know, we do physics. We introduce them to the university as a place that welcomes them, that feels like a place that they could go to. Many of them don't know anybody who's been to university, so that's a big step for them. We're setting up a homework program where kids from local schools can come to campus after school. We'll support them. I'm going to revise my GCSE maths and physics and A-level maths and physics. We're going to give them a little taste of our research just to entice them to think about what they could do, and we're going to give them free hot meals before they go home again. That's just a few things that we do, and this is replicated across the country. So, you know, universities play a role, not just in educating our own students, but in supporting the pipeline all the way through, and I think that's important. And then the other thing I was just going to mention is that maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but I don't think university is necessarily the path that every student wants to take. And I think we have to recognise that there must be different pathways to enter the space sector that aren't just A-levels, university, and on we go. And so we, and maybe you'll mention this, have been talking a lot and thinking a lot about this over recent years, thinking about apprenticeships and what we can do in that sector. I think we have a level 4 and a level 6 apprenticeship. And thinking about also just helping people to transition across to the space sector, because there are lots of people out there with lots of skills that we need that are working in other sectors, and I think it's important for us to consider pathways for them to come from wherever they are and end up supporting our space economy however we can. So it's a few things that we've been thinking about. I'm sure other people have been thinking about that too. And yeah, I think the future's really bright if we can get this workforce situation sorted. Thank you.
Thank you. So perhaps I'll touch on a couple of points, building on what was said already. I think one of the key things for me is that obviously the space sector is in a dynamic state of change, has been for a long time. That's not showing no signs of abating. I think one of the elements that we need to also take into consideration is that emerging spacefaring nations are investing quite heavily in the space sector. So the space sector is becoming increasingly competitive, with more countries spending more of their GDP on research, developing their own launch capabilities, their own technologies. So we have to be mindful of that. One of the other aspects that's key for me is that when we think of sustainability, we should be thinking of the cislunar, the Earth-Moon ecosystem, taking into account cislunar space as well as the lunar surface. So when we think about regulation, given all of the emphasis that we are seeing in terms of going back to the moon, extracting resources from the lunar surface, we should be thinking about how do we sustainably explore and exploit the space environment. And I think there are a number of strands to that. One, it's not just about the regulation. It's also about the technologies that allow you to explore and exploit space sustainably. The other strand that I wanted to build on was the partnerships and the importance of partnerships, particularly with our allies. One of the key things that was signed earlier this year was the Atlantic Declaration. That is quite an important development because it opens up the potential for greater interaction and collaboration between the UK and the United States, but we should also not neglect the smaller emerging and existing spacefaring nations. So from a space park-centric perspective, we see the importance of underpinning technologies. The UK has developed and is developing transformational technologies that could have a significant impact on exploration, on in-situ resource utilization, on developing the lunar economy, in addition to addressing some of the global challenges by focusing more on Earth observation and how science can help alleviate some of those global challenges. So there are those important strands. So from a Leicester specific perspective, we are building those international partnerships. We are supporting the development of transformational technologies by working with partners in academia and in industry. And the importance of those partnerships also straddles the academic industrial divide. So focusing on developing a cluster in the heart of the Midlands that will build those international partnerships, attract inward investment, and also create a more dynamic academic industrial activity in the heart of the UK. So I'll stop there and hand back to the chair.
Thank you, thanks so much. I mean, I think 4 fascinating interventions and contributions there. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to witness an act of great self-control, and that is, I'm not going to pitch any follow-up questions to our speakers today, simply because I think we want to maximise the time for this excellent audience to ask questions as well. I'm aware, I saw you taking lots of notes there, George, so you may have some response to you, but perhaps we can integrate them into the Q&A section that's just about to begin. The only note I'll give to our audience as I begin the Q&A is that actually we don't have a roving mic capability for this session, so I'm going to ask people to sort of speak up, and when they do so, please introduce themselves at the beginnings of their questions as well. So please do raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. Oh, we do have a hand.
Well, if you could all hear us.
Can you all hear us? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Some hands here. Yes, do you want to go back to the table?
Lovely, thank you. I usually speak quite loudly, so I don't know whether this is needed. But anyway, so I'm Chris Clerk, I'm from the Nuclear Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, part of the Catapult Network. And I wanted to add something to your list, actually, which is the opportunity to think about space-based power systems and the work that Rolls-Royce are doing around novel nuclear reactors and micro-reactors, which could be incredibly useful when it comes to the powering lunar exploration or deep-based missions and so on. So I think there's a great opportunity there to build on a strength. It would be good to get your comments on that. And just to double down on the Midlands and the East Midlands, we see huge potential around Derby, Leicester, and so on, that space, around novel nuclear, working very closely with companies in that area. There's a great opportunity there. And I'm going to add one final point, if I can, which is STEM is fantastic. We need more STEM. It's really good, the work that you're doing. I think we need more STEM in politics. I think we definitely need more STEM in the civil service as well, actually. So if you could reach out to some of my former colleagues in the civil service, that would be brilliant.
Right, let's take one more question, and then I'll come back to the panel. Yes, sir, here, near the front here with the... there we go.
Great, thank you very much. James Kennel, Viasat, formerly from Inmarsat. Very much appreciate your comments, and maybe marrying together from Minister and also from Richard, that was starting to go in the direction of thinking about sort of what sort of space power does the UK want to be. And, you talked about the various different divisions and potentially being in the pit lane, and it would strike me that thinking about the UK as a space power and where we want to be would be a far more flexible and fit-for-purpose way of putting in place metrics that we can track progress and incentivize activities, conscious that I'm sat next to probably the preeminent space economist who develops most of the metrics that we use at the moment. And finally, a comment on space sustainability. I think it's true that we could consider ourselves as a pit lane providing all sorts of services, but just in which, for example, the Clean Air Act fundamentally transformed the way in which we go about power, setting up industrial facilities, etc. The post-CFC response to ozone, etc., created a whole new set of economies there. Taking a leadership on space sustainability could prove to be very far-sighted, as the whole space sector will totally have to reimagine itself in the next 10 or 15 years. And the present primes might not be the future primes, a whole new set of players there, and the size of the prize could be absolutely immense.
Thank you, thanks so much. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions, but let's see if the panel wants to respond directly to any of those. Shall I start with you?
Yeah, but very briefly, Richard's point on space power is really well made, and I think one of the ways we should and could think about the space economy is it's the testbed laboratory for many of the technologies that we need on Earth. And the realities of space mean you have to do everything with micro quantities of water. You have to, with the lunar economy, we're going to be growing crops, we're going to be doing new life science, food. So it's a laboratory for the technologies on Earth, and particularly in energy. And I think the space-based solar is worth looking at. And I first was asked to go and support it as minister, and my civil servants, to the point, said, "We think this is actually for the birds and stuff. You can't build an array in space." I think it's my job to say, why not? I mean, why not? It's not that. So I think there is something really interesting in there, and the small nuclear piece is also a key part of it. And on James, well, your point is well made. I suppose my answer to the question, what's the space power, is a soft power. So I think we have a huge opportunity as we go from a wild west of chuck it up, anything goes, and sort of Chinese-American competition, to laying the regulatory paths for sustainability. But that's why I'm doing it. But there's something else, that if you take the view that we can't clutter the low Earth orbits with metal, partly because it's not safe, partly because it will stop scientists doing the old science, then one of the interesting things about DCIT is we've now got, I've got the power to regulate spectrum from DCMS, as well as, so that gets really interesting. I'd like us to be the people who say, look, we want OneWeb Gen 2 to be able to deliver for the European Union if they want to have a completely encrypted, secure comms satellite system, which they don't want us to be part of for some weird reason, but I understand. If they want to do that, then spectrum technology and spectrum licensing, we should be rewarding the technologies that expand the efficient use of spectrum, not the people who chuck up the most metal. So I think the regulatory piece isn't just good for carrying the next generation with us, to see this isn't just billionaires playing with rockets, this is the UK leading in the sustainability of space. It's also very smart economics. And on the civil service, one of the things we're doing at DCIT is trying to, this is a passion of mine, they're good officials. But I was in venture capital, I know my stuff, but I'm 15 years out of date. And so we're going to try and get 20% of DCIT staff at any one time to be embedded in the sector, and 15% of staff from the sector, and try and make DCIT a place that is genuinely mixing private and public sector expertise. It's a challenge. Sarah Mundy, our permanent secretary, is committed to it, and I think that would really help, because there is no one person who knows everything. The key is just keeping up to date and being aware of what's going on.
Very interesting. Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? I think it sort of sits behind some of the questions we've had already, actually, which is we're obviously in a moment where everything is very expensive. I mean, quite literally, things are getting more expensive as we sit here. Government attention is divided. There's 1,000 things demanding government time. Your position as minister, you see that more than anyone else. How hard are you finding it to advocate for the kinds of projects you're describing to us within government right now?
Look, I think politics is always contested, right? I mean, there is no golden corridor to the magic lever of, there you go, money, ching. David was a genius at working the back corridors of the Treasury and getting money for science. It's not easy. So, you know, that's the first answer. The second is, I think, by taking the approach I'm taking, which is every department has an interest in this, even if you haven't realised it. And I think that really helps. I think moving the agenda on from could we have the biggest rocket, could we, to hang on, this is an economy that's growing and driving levelling up investment from Glasgow to Leicester to Cornwall, that really helps. So I think how we advocate for it, but also just reminding people that we rely on it every day for a million functions, from your car to your phone to, so I think it's winnable and I relish the challenge.
Yes.
Just to touch a little bit on the power generation piece, I think one of the key things that perhaps is less visible is that last year there was a significant investment that was made through the European Space Agency into what we call the Endure program. The Endure program is centered on the development of nuclear power technologies for space. Now, what is also perhaps not evident is that we are actually going to be launching radioisotope power technologies in a few years' time as part of the European Space Agency program. This is a University of Leicester National Nuclear Laboratory activity that spans over a decade. So if we think about reactors as the future, radioisotope power technologies are now. So in terms of unlocking the ability to extract resources in situ and have responsible, sustainable lunar surface exploration, the UK has the industry, the supply chain, the capability to lead globally in nuclear power technologies for space. So that, when I was talking about underpinning technology that is enabling, where the UK can play a significant role on a global stage, that is one very good example of how we can bridge between academia and industry and have a global impact.
Yeah, and I would add, when we talk to NASA, it's one of the UK assets they are most interested in, our nuclear power capabilities. I just wanted to make one comment on James's question about us as a space power. And that is, what kind of space power? Because there are different perceptions which are complementary, but also involve trade-offs. One picture is dynamic, enterprising, the place where private companies around the world want to set up a shop, because of all the work that George does on issues like financial services and insurance, plus advantages such as our regulatory regime to our geographical location. However, there is a very different agenda which comes from the security people. And the biggest single change in science and technology policy in the past 10 years has been the arrival of the security interest in a way that it was not present when I started as the minister in 2010. And for them, the issues are, do we have a security requirement for this? What is there a national requirement? Is our model own or collaborate or access? That is a framework that you bring if you come from a security background and start thinking about technology like space. And they are two very different ways of seeing the world. I welcome the arrival of security people because, to be honest, they've brought more money, more resource, more influence. But the fact is that sometimes in the space agency, there's some wild and wacky American entrepreneur who's got a fantastic project and he or she is thinking of locating it in the UK, and we think, wow, if we offer a bit of money, we might get a $100 million investment. That's fantastic. And then someone turns up from the security side of the government and says, hang on a second, do we have a national requirement? Do we need to own or collaborate or access with this? So they are two different ways of analysing what you do in space. And I think we're still finding our way to striking the right balance between them.
I'd be interested, Suzie, if you think that philosophical difference, that classic tension between these different applications, these different mentalities about space and space science might feed through into the points you were making about diversifying and ensuring the skills are there for aerospace.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we think about a lot, all these conversations that we have all the time. I was just thinking about, now I've lost my train of thought.
I'm so sorry.
I was thinking about something. I'll come back to that. Yeah, you're not questioning, that's my thought. I was thinking actually a little bit about, so the Royal Society have commissioned some work on the future of space, and their piece of work, which hopefully will be published next year, is under construction at the moment, is looking at 2075 and beyond. And that also sort of feeds back into what I mentioned earlier. I was talking about our mission timescales, maybe they're 20 or 30 years, but actually some of the work that we're doing now has to be much more forward thinking than that, because the things we put in place now influence what we're going to be doing in 2075 and beyond. And we commissioned some chats with the general public. We invited them to come and talk with us about a load of different topics to try and get kind of what do people really know about space, and where do they get their information from, what are they interested in, do they know the kind of things that we're talking about. And we asked them where they get their space news from, hoping they'd say, oh, scientists like you, Suzie, that's where we get our space news from. And the answer is not even the news, it's things like books, science fiction. You know, if that's where people are getting their space news from, then we have a lot of work to do. So anyway, it's a really interesting piece of work if anyone's interested in looking far more further forwards than where we're discussing at the moment, then check out this Royal Society piece. It's going to be really interesting.
No, thank
You're
you.
going to jump in.
I was just going to say something about the skills part. What we're seeing is increasing demand for continuous professional development programs, particularly in different sectors of the economy, but also straddling across to the defence side. Given that the defence machine in terms of space is growing, there is a need for people who are already in post to gain new skills and to be exposed to what it means to build, develop and put something to space. So we are seeing increasing demand on that front. So that's at one end of the spectrum. But we're also seeing increasing appetite at the other end of the spectrum for apprenticeship programs. So the whole skills landscape within the UK is changing, and universities will have to adapt to that changing landscape.
And from your point of view, are those demands being met, or is there what you described as a skills gap?
I think we're trying to meet those demands, but I think that the demand will increase and there'll be a gap, and we'll have to address that gap.
Thank you. All right, lots of hands have just gone up. What a gratifying sight that is. All right, let's try and take 3 quick questions to put to the panel then, starting with Simon here. Yes.
Thanks, Simon. Sorry, I'm a bit dry throat. So I'm Simon Godfrey from BT Minister. You've been to our place in Ipswich a few times. Thank you for that. But as well as being a BT employee, I'm also chair of the Technique Public Sector Union. And one of my roles there is to do exactly what we've been talking about and encourage SMEs to come into the country. I'm actively involved with one at the moment who wants to place 100 jobs somewhere, maybe in the Leicester area or maybe in Suffolk. But it comes back to the issue of opportunity and procurement and risk. And I'm encouraged by your points about changing the procurement paradigm, because at the moment, they don't have loads of money like Elon Musk. They need to come out and focus on the projects so they make their work viable and tenable for the mid-term, not just the short term. So that's point number 1. So I'd encourage you to pick up the pace on procurement if you possibly can. That would be hugely useful. And on skills, Suzie, I'm meeting a globally interesting person on Wednesday evening who's a lady who's focused on women in STEM. What message would you like me to take to her? Because she's got access to some fantastic people and organisations to really accelerate the UK's place in STEM.
I would say that actually the way to do it, so I tried to I went to hundreds, I spoke to like 60,000 kids single-handedly, and that is quite exhausting. So my advice would be partner with others who already have networks that you can then tap into if this person would like to kind of showcase what they've done or what their company could do and their workforce, want to get involved. Partner with, it doesn't have to be universities, there are lots of charities out there as well to make your message go further so that they don't have to attempt to sort of single-handedly change the world, because that was a challenge, I would say.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more questions. Yes, sir. You've been waiting on this first round.
So, Professor John Woodward from Northumbria University, and to come into the skills piece, I guess, looking at the workforce of tomorrow, how do we streamline the regulatory burden around things like degree apprenticeships, which are causing universities significant trouble for delivery? And how do we fund STEM, FE and HE appropriately in what appears at the moment to be a sort of policy void in the HE sector for funding, discussion of funding?
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll take our final question. Yes, the gentleman at the back, please. Just over here.
It's dead.
Oh, it's dead.
No.
Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ian Jones, I'm the CEO of Green Hilly Earth Station down in Cornwall. So I'm an entrepreneur and an engineer in the satellite industry. I think it's great, George, we had a meeting with other entrepreneurs from the space sector a few weeks ago. We're putting some ideas together. I think this concept of government being the procurement agency for space companies is really, really important. And I think one of the things that's been missing in our thinking about how space is funded is that we need to promote the sort of early development of science, and that's all been great, but other countries do things differently. We think about America as being the great sort of entrepreneurial sort of beacon, how we work, but we forget that the American government has a massive budget and they spend that budget in space. So that, I think that really helps. Another key thing I think that we need to impress is that there are a few months left, perhaps, of this government before we really start to get into campaigning mode for the next election. And whilst there are, it's great to see that there are new initiatives coming out of the Space Agency, more grants and that sort of thing, to have the patient time to attract funding in. We need to have initiatives that you can make a difference in literally in the next few months, and I think that's a really key thing. And there are ideas, I think, that will be coming through in that paper that the UK Space will be putting to you that can make the difference at the time that you want to make the difference. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. So no pressure there.
So I'm going to deal with procurement, and I think David and Suzie and Richard are leave to do skills, not least because David was Minister for Science and Universities, and I'm responsible for university research, but not students. Rob Halfon is University Minister who deals with skills. And I think there's an issue here that every cluster I go to, I ask. It's the North East. I look at what Northumbria are doing in Cornwall, and it's obvious there's a sort of 3, 5, 10-year job requirement, job creation. And when I ask, has anyone actually written this down by sector or by geography and spoken to DFE about it? That doesn't seem to be happening. And so I think there's a real issue, David. I'd be very interested in your responses to how Rob Halfon and I can tackle that. But on procurement, I'm really cheered. I think there's a strong message of support for a cross-government framework. We haven't got the SBRI, the American scheme, remember, was a validation for SMEs. If you got the tick, you were US procurement compliant. And then they had the DARPA budget behind it, which is the US defence establishment. You could be a little startup with a brilliant bit of technology, SBRI compliant, tick, big procurement. We haven't got the scale of that procurement. We're not the US military. But I think we could duck and dive and be smart and build a framework cross-government so that it's not just me as Space Minister and the MOD over there. It's government recognising that SATCOM space data is key for lots of sectors, not least DEFRA. I mean, one of the challenges we have now, post-common agriculture policy, is to set out the UK agri-environment compliance framework. And if that's based on teenagers with clipboards visiting every farm, saying how many flowers have we got, not going to work. We need to be using space data really well. It's very accurate. We could build a really smart space-based economy. Richard Bennion totally gets that. So I think the procurement piece I totally get. And on the point about the budget and the immediate short term, Jeremy Hunt is really interested in this sector. I take the challenge. I think the world is looking at the UK and saying, are you guys really serious about this? And I think there's a budget moment. It's not all about money, but it's a moment. And then there's one in the spring. And I think part of the reason it's wonderful having David to show the Space Agency, we've got 2 windows, and Jeremy Hunt is really interested in this sector. As long as our ask is sensible, and it's not just give us billions or, but we can show how this can drive growth all around the country. I think there are people in the Treasury who are interested and up for this conversation, and we as a sector have got to put a strong case.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, following on as George passed the tricky issue of university financing over to me. I mean, there are real pressures on universities now, and although the university sector, I think, is agonising about new structures, it's really very simple. If you basically freeze the fees for 10 years, then the real unit of resource available for educating each student falls quite considerably. And this is having a direct impact on R&D funding, because it used to be the case that universities made a profit on overseas students and used that to help fund research, much of which is only funded at 75 or 80% of full economic cost. Now, the net revenues from overseas students are used to cross-subsidise domestic students, because domestic students cost more to educate than the level of the fee. And that means there is a hidden cut in R&D spend being delivered because of the freeze in student fees. My view is that it should be, I've long thought that it would be perfectly reasonable, once a Parliament, to say there should be a review of the calibration of the system. What's the right repayment threshold, given what's happened to earnings? What's the right fee level, given what's happening to the cost of educating students? The interest rate charge became very controversial, a reason I completely understand. You can change the... So no, it's just the basic model of graduate repayment is endlessly flexible, and the problem is it's got stuck, and it's got stuck at a level which is putting increasing pressure on universities.
Thank you. I saw you nodding in agreement there, Suzie.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually one of the things that we struggle with is keeping our best graduates to stay at the universities in the UK. We see a lot of people going abroad. They might stay with us for undergrad, go to a PhD as well. They might stay with us for a PhD. We've invested a lot of time and money, not grudgingly, but we have, you know, in their education, and we'd love to keep them. And they get an amazing job offer from somewhere else, and off they go. And, you know, we have this brain drain. So yeah, we also would love to see the UK being a more attractive environment for people to be career scientists and work longer in universities, for sure.
And Richard, that's a big part of what your work involves.
Well, the big part of what we're doing in Space Park is try to retain the graduates, because by attracting industry into the cluster and creating greater economic activity, that should allow us to retain more of our graduates and create more jobs in the region. So that's the challenge we're addressing on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, well, thank you. Unless anyone on the panel has one last thought in our final minute here, then I am going to have to say to our audience, I'm so sorry, but we are all out of time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I thought the questions we did have were really, really helpful. Please join me in thanking our fantastic, brilliant panel today. I thought that was